I may have explained that I am a member of Academia EDU online. And Academia EDU is a very interesting bird in that it is for academicians, but it also admits independent researchers and investigators and interested people into its membership if they pay for it, which gives independent researchers access to academia, which normally is a closed system. So recently they implemented a new project, and that project is to act as a sort of an online journal in their own right, which is to say that they solicit submissions, but these papers have to be no more than 1,600 words. And then they advertise or attempt to get these things reviewed by other members within 2 weeks and make a decision, and then they publish online in their own system. So in a sense, you get published in a scholarly journal, certainly not a very prestigious one, but even though you're not connected with academia, you can get published, see? So I started availing myself of that, and already one of them has been published, and that is the true authorship of, quote, The Ragpicker, or Bound and Free. Then there's another one on the subject of the parody of the Raven called The Vulture, which I recently discussed. Let's see, I think that was the August 5th video blog entry. That's also been accepted. It hasn't been published online yet. And then I have 3 more papers in the wings. So what I'm doing within 1,600 words is just taking one little slice of this huge tapestry of Mathew Franklin Whittier's legacy, and I'm picking something I can absolutely prove. You know, I mean, I can prove that George Burnham was not the real author of The Ragpicker, as is believed. And I can prove that the Vulture appeared first in the December 1852 edition of the Carpetbag. So, I mean, these are definite things. These are things that the historians have missed that I can prove. So, you know, of course, it's not easy to introduce a new topic like that in 1,600 words. I can do it because I still remember how to write, having been a professional author. And they're pretty good papers. At least one person has commented on how well it's written so far. But what I wanted to share was the numbers. This is kind of interesting. Now, what I think they do is they just send out an email blast, I guess. I haven't gotten one about my own paper, but they must just notify members somehow, you know, without a lot of concern about, you know, what their particular field is. So these people may just click on the link and look at it briefly out of curiosity and then leave. Some of them read the whole paper. It's a 4-page paper with the footnotes, so I see 3 pages read, 4 pages read. Sometimes it's downloaded. Sometimes I don't see that any pages are read. So far as I know, they clicked on the link, they looked at it, said, "Oh, this is not in my field," and they're out. So it may be partly word of mouth, but we can't assume that these figures I'm going to give you are word of mouth, like there's a big buzz going on and everybody's excited and everybody's telling their friend and all that. I mean, that's my first, you know, fond imagining, you know, when I saw these numbers, and I thought, no, I bet you that's not it. Because when I looked at they show you the other papers they've downloaded recently, like 2 or 3, and some of them are biology or, you know, something totally irrelevant to this topic. Some of them are Christian theologians. Some of them are into social reform, you know, Marxists and so on. There's a mix. And some of them will read other papers. One person read this paper and then went back and read about half of my paper concerning A Christmas Carol. That's what I want to see, is this crossover. On August 25th, 81 people, 81 unique visitors. I'm going to go by unique visitors, that stat. Then the next day, the 26th, was 205. There's 205 people that at least looked at my paper, you know. Then 197, then 169, and yesterday was 178. It ticked up a little bit. And already today, as of 20 minutes to 7, and it's now 12 minutes to 7, there were 58 unique visitors. So today could very well be as high as yesterday's, which means it's not diminishing, which is kind of strange for an email blast, you know, or a notification. You'd think if everybody got notified on the 25th that it would taper off, and start out big and taper off, whereas this is maintaining almost 200 unique visitors per day. I don't know what it means. None of these people message me. None of these people write to me. There's no feedback. There's nobody wants to discuss it. I'd really like to talk to you about this. None of that happens. They're just lurkers, you might say. They silently look at this. And when I say that, because it's big, I mean, this is a discovery. This is a fairly major discovery in and of itself. Never mind A Christmas Carol and The Raven and all that, which those are more shockers. But from the academic point of view, this is a significant discovery that, as one might expect, an abolitionist and an author, the younger brother of the poet and abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier, actually was not a hack after all. Actually, he wrote one of the most significant anti-slavery novels of the period, anonymously, and it's dedicated to their sister Elizabeth, who is an important figure in the Whittier legacy. So it's a significant find, but doesn't anybody want to talk to me about it? It's interesting. I don't know how many of them connect it with my other work concerning A Christmas Carol and so on, how many are afraid to talk to me because of that. Anyway, the gist of that is that although I've already eaten up like almost 7 minutes, I want to try to keep this kind of brief. So I'm going to try this time not to branch off too much. But sometimes I will go into my little tiny library and I'll pull out the books like this one, Knickerbocker, volume 47 from 1856. I guess the first half of 1856. And I'll just kind of poke around and look at the pieces, kind of just gloating over my collection, so to speak, or nostalgically going over it. And this one contains the last cayenne pepper poem in this series in the Knickerbocker. There's another one that shows up much later on in Vanity Fair, but this one is called Turkle, Tirkle, a poem. And it's about a turtle, but he's called a turkle. And there's a couple interesting clues that I saw in here. So the first one is the name Turkle itself. And if you look up the definition on Merriam-Webster of a turkle, spelling it Turkle, you'll find that it's a dialect rendition of turtle, a turtle. So apparently the people on the East Coast, the rural people, use this. I found a couple references online on Google, but it wasn't easy. There's a children's book that talks about this culture and calls it a turkle. And then there's a song that somebody made about turkle meat. And that's the only references I could find, which means that it wasn't commonly used, because if it was common, I would have found a bunch of 19th century period references. Old newspapers come up in Google searches, and compilations of poetry from the 19th century. And if it was common, I would have seen it. So apparently it was used among certain groups, but it was not common. What this was Mathew Franklin Whittier was fascinated by dialects of all kinds, and he had a collection of his favorite words, see? And you can find these words throughout his legacy, because he would use them over and over because they amused him. He had like a little collection. Well, Turkle apparently was in his collection of dialect. So I thought, well, let's see if I can find it anywhere else. And I looked in my database. I didn't find a single instance of Turkle, but I know better than to just give up with one spelling. So eventually I found it under the actual spelling, the one that's in Merriam-Webster, Turkle, Turkle. And there were 4 other instances. So we're going to go into them, and I'll show them to you on the screen, because I've got, with the exception of one of these, I have everything originals here. So I'm going to read from the originals, and I'm going to show you what I photographed this morning from the originals. But first I want to read you the first portion of this poem, not very long, maybe 15 lines or so, of Turkle, a poem. Now, these are always tough to read because sometimes you can't even figure out what the word is right away. Distinguished muse. So he's writing once again to his muse. Now, it occurred to me that his muse could be Abby. He could be reaching across the Great Divide to her for inspiration for poetry. So I can't say that for sure, but I think that's a possibility. Distinguished Muse, your humble friend still lives. Through 1 year's stream he has sadly navigated and not been swallowed by the billows. Muse, he has been cold, his clothes been also wet, his health very poor. He has had influenza and, alas, sore throat. Biles has continued for to make periodical appearance, and his heart has been well nigh broke completely. Muse, your humble friend will not complain. The glory of his achievements pays him well for everything inflicted onto him. The immortal poem which just 1 year ago you helped him for to write will ever live and magnify his name like telescopes which makes a great world of a little star. I can't believe I didn't catch that at first. I wonder how many of my viewers here caught it. Which makes a great world of a little star. Well, that's his star. He's talking about himself. And as this clown, this Victor Borgia type clown, he's saying that he knows what he's accomplished and that he, in this character, he is famous for his works. As Matthew, he should be famous if he hadn't done everything anonymously. And he is the star. See? So here Matthew is talking about his own greatness and knowing what fame he normally would have had his work not been falsely attributed to other people and had he not written anonymously. Well, there's a couple other clues in here. For one thing, we know from other clues that I've shared recently that Matthew has probably taken a place in the country. Rented, purchased, I don't know. But he's become a kind of a gentleman farmer, whether he lives there all the time or part of the time. But there's references to this in several different things written around this period. So I had given the opinion that he probably took a farm to have a place to take his third daughter, little 7-year-old Allie, that would be away from his ex-wife, give her a place to run around, you know. But there's also indications that his health was pretty bad at this point. Now, of course, Matthew would have been exposed to tuberculosis because Abby had died of TB many years earlier. It could be that that was what was starting to affect him and he didn't know what it was. It could be something else. But there's another reference that we'll see to his health being bad. So that's another autobiographical reference. Now let's look at instances of Matthew using the word turkle. And we have to go back all the way to his first character, Joe Strickland. Now, Joe Strickland was not written by the lottery shop owner, George W. Arnold, as one scholar believed. He was fooled by an editor who thought maybe it had been, and the editor was mistaken, and so was the scholar. It was written by Matthew when he ran away from home at age 12 and went to Boston and then went to New York City and wrote for 3 different newspapers, one in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, one in Boston, and one in New York City. And he created this runaway character. This guy was from Vermont instead of from Haverhill, Massachusetts. But basically, it was once again himself clowning around, see, writing as though he was a country bumpkin who could barely spell with lots of malapropisms and, you know, it's very funny, but it's very, very heavy on the dialect and the misspelling, so much so that you almost can't get through it. I think in the day, people had more patience for such things. But at any rate, the one that I have a physical copy of that has turkle in it shows up in the February 13, 1830 Philadelphia album. It's the Philadelphia Album and Ladies Literary Gazette in 1830. Here's a copy of it. It has the owner's name in the front of all things, but I think you can see the spine. And we're going to have a look at that. I'm just going to read a little bit of this and put it up on the screen for you. For some reason, I had my keyboard in my lap, which I don't need to do. So we're going to open the album here. This is little teensy-weensy type. I'm going to bring my light down. Let's see here. Joe Strickland. And there's a little introduction from the editor, which we won't read. he starts out, "Dear Colonel Stun, for all I don't know not half so much about you as you art to know about me, I'm willin' to call you Dear Colonel, 'case somebody that used to live in New England said you was a Yankee." So he goes on about like that. You can see how thick the dialect and the misspelling is on this. Howard's down here with another patent right. He's the same man that sold Mammy Gates the patent link filler that would stuff a link 40 rod long in 2 minutes. The think he's got now is a kind of ladle that goes by clockwork to eat turkle soup with. So there you see turkle soup, written by Joe Strickland, which is Mathew Franklin Whittier. This, by the way, so far as I can tell, is the very first character like this in America. So Mathew launched this genre of speaking and writing in Yankee dialect. And don't let anybody else tell you otherwise unless they can prove it. If they've got anything before 1825, fine. Now, let's see. The second instance of turkle is in the New York Transcript, the December 10, 1834 edition. It's not signed, but Mathew had a heavy presence in this paper. This was Asa Green's third newspaper, his second one in New York City. Mathew edited for the second one, the Constellation. He contributed the blotter, which we would call it now, for the New York Transcript in 1834, 1835. And all of these stories that are kind of rustic characters, this is Mathew. This is not Asa Green. So when you read about Asa Green the humorist, it's not Asa Green the humorist. It's Asa Green, the owner of the newspaper who ran his bookstore in New York City, and it's Mathew Franklin Whittier, the humorist. So here we have the New York transcripts that I own, and it just so happens out of the 5 or so in here, one of them is the one in which he uses turkle. So I got very lucky on that score. This is the December 10, 1834 edition right here. And let's see. This little story is called The Widow Griffin's Courtship. On the second page, down towards the bottom of the first column, "You didn't know that turkles ever went into the water?" exclaimed Jonas with equal astonishment. "Why, they live half the time in water, and some of them all the time," etc., etc., etc. Well, it's a misunderstanding. She thought he meant turtle doves, and he's talking about turtles and whatever. But there's turkles for you. Put that away. Again, that's 1834, so we're way, way, way before cayenne pepper. Now, I'm entirely mindful that these could be, that cayenne pepper could be an imitation, but it's not. There's too many indicators, including style and just the sheer quality of the thing, that point to Mathew Franklin Whittier. Let's see, next up we have, as soon as I can find it, Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle was the first humorous magazine patterned after Britain's Punch, for example, in America. All I have is a reprint where somebody in India has taken Google's files and printed them, and not all in order either. The Google one isn't all in order. But anyway, be that as it may, in the August 14, 1847 edition of Yankee Doodle, we have the 4th chapter of a series called Various Attempts to See the Elephant. And this is about a character named Joshua Greening. This is also Mathew Franklin Whittier's character. He has this fellow coming from a little town in New York to New York City, and he has many adventures. Every chapter he's swindled in a different way. So this is really Mathew's attempt to warn the country people that come to live in New York City about the different ways that they can be swindled. So here we are. What he did is he bought a suit by somebody who pressured him, a salesman who pressured him into it, and it doesn't fit at all. It says, "But I think that our feller made some mistake in the measure. If he cheated me, look out for snapping turkles." Well, I think he means like pistols. But at any rate, snapping turkles is here for turtles, and that's the next instance, and it's another one of Mathew's characters. Now, the last one is Ethan Spike, which historians have agreed was Mathew Franklin Whittier, so there's no question on authorship with that one. It appears in the May 21st, 1859 edition, which we have here. I don't think you can see the spine on that. This is archival plastic, but it's not the right kind, so it keeps wanting to come off. So here we have a letter from Ethan Spike from Hornby, written supposedly May 1859. This is the only one that's after cayenne pepper. He's become an inventor, and he's invented an antidote for mosquitoes. And here he says, I plastered myself with it, went down to Turkle Swamp, and sat down to wait for the mosquitoes. So there's Turkle Swamp, which is obviously Turtle Swamp. But there's another clue in this letter. I've said that when Cayenne Pepper writes his poem about the turtle, he talks about himself as a genius who has written this wonderful poem, and he's now famous, see? Well, Ethan Spike, in this letter, talks about how he's always known that he was a genius, but he didn't seem to quite know how to express it or how to achieve fame, see? So I'm going to read quite a bit of this introduction to get across this point. I allers had an idea that I was cut out for suthin', but couldn't just tell what. Ever since I warn't more than so year old, I'd been subject to risins and bilins of internal genus, so that I knowed that nater had been profligate in getting up my interior circumbambancy, and that sooner or later I should bile over. True, I didn't know the particular stripe of genus I was. Still, I knew there was an earthquake hatching in me, which must bust. And them subterfugian fires of unsophisticated nater-gin talent wouldn't rest. They was allers hissin' and sputterin' and driving me about just as though I was a screechin' locomotive with the steam on. Afore I was knee-high to a wheelbarrow, I used to holler in my sleep, specially arter eatin' baked punkin or sausages for supper. Doc Pike used to say 'twas nightmares, but now I know just as well as can be that 'twas the Promethean fires of native talent a-workin' in me like new cider in a tight-bunged barrel. Then, in arter life, suthin' was allers a whisperin' me that I was made for better things than hoein' tedders and feedin' hogs as the prodigious sun did. It driv me into politics, poetry, patriotism, and general literature by turns, but I never felt to hum in either. There was allers an aching void that hadn't got nothing into it on account of being empty. I knew there must be suthin' behind, else I shouldn't feel so. And sure enough, the mounting has traveled, and now it has brung forth. So he knows he's an inventor now, see? But this is autobiographical, Mathew clowning around, but really speaking of himself. You notice that there's a number of words spelled exactly the same way that Cayenne Pepper spells them. This is classic Ethan Spike spelling, including things like unsophisticated instead of unsophisticated. It's used in Cayenne Pepper also, and a number of other little idiosyncrasies. Now, as to the matter of Mathew being ill during this period, there's another little piece of evidence on this, and then we'll close this out in a timely fashion. There is a letter that Mathew wrote to his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, dated May 11, 1854. So this is right about in this same period, not too long before Cayenne Pepper appears. It's around the time that Caleb Leathers appears, the one that mentioned Cayenne Pepper with great praise. And this is about the time that all the references of Mathew taking a place in the country appear. So he says, thy letter and inclusion were duly received. I was greatly obliged for both. I should have written before, but one of the regular clerks in the post office has been sick over 8 weeks, and I have filled his place in addition to my own work there. From 5 in the morning until 11 to 12 at night, every moment of my time has been occupied, and even now I have only a moment to spare. The work is rather too hard for me, but as I can earn considerable by it, I have stuck to it day and night 7 days in the week, because everything is so awful dear that it requires all exertion to keep along. My health has been tolerably good all winter, but all this spring my cough has been troublesome. Several nights after working till midnight have occupied the entire balance of the night in barking. And then he talks about a house that he had intended to buy. I have lost the chance of buying the house I mentioned. The owner got an offer for more than he asked me, etc., etc. So from this, we know that Matthew was sick, that he was working very hard during this period, that he was at the post office. All of this I knew. He had moved to Portland so he could help raise his third daughter, Allie, rather than traveling around as he had been previously. He was traveling as an inspector, a postal inspector, but he took the job in Portland, I think, so that he could help raise Allie. And we know that he's looking for a place. So apparently he found a place out in the country, and partly because of his health. That's really about all here. It all ties together. It shows that Matthew was writing each of these characters. It shows that he had his favorite little colloquialisms and bits and pieces of dialect that he loved and would keep on inserting into his work because he loved them. They were part of his collection. It shows that he went to the country, apparently got a place in the country around 1855. 1855, October of 1855, is when he published The Ragpicker, or Bound and Free. And of course, he would have been paid for that. And that would have given him the money to buy. He may have gotten an advance for all I know, but that would have given him the money to buy the farm. So it all fits together. And you can see the depth of this thing. So when I write one of these little 1,600 word papers, of course, I can only just focus on one thing. I'm trying to focus on things that I can prove. I know and I can prove that George Burnham couldn't possibly have been the author of A Ragpicker, and that he attached his name to it briefly, and somehow that got picked up. These papers are, only 3 pages long. They're not a big time commitment, So you can find that on Academia EDU. But anyway, these little papers, they can't go into all this depth, and there are people who read them and say, well, there's not enough evidence. Well, there isn't, because it's very deep. I could, as you've seen, I'm not going to do it anymore today, but I can dig and dig and dig and keep coming up with more interconnected, facts. So that's enough for now. This turned out, this was going to be like 6 minutes. It's now 36 minutes before editing. And there's so much more that I could share here, but clearly K.N. Pepper is Mathew Franklin Whittier. Clearly Caleb Leathers is Mathew Franklin Whittier. And clearly Matthew was Joshua Greening, and he was Joe Strickland back in 1825, and he was writing for the New York Transcript in that unsigned piece in 1834. It all ties together, see? I'm at a loss as to how to wrap this one up. I have to wrap it up, but I don't know how to wrap it up because there's so much more I would like to share. And I really would love to get across to somebody just how interconnected all this is. And I'm so tired of trying to prove things to people. See, I'm so anxious to forge on ahead and share Matthew's legacy with people instead of having to stop and prove things constantly, see? And instead of having people just not believe me, there's so much more to share about this. And I long for the day when I don't have to be constantly dealing with the issue of proof, and I don't have to constantly be dealing with people who are skeptical or cynical, when, I can actually share some of this legacy in a straightforward way without having to worry about those things.